Our cinema audience will have just, by the time they see this, they will have just finished watching your film. And so before we speak more specifically about the logistics of how you made the film remotely from your home in America, I wanted to start by asking you, do you remember the first piece of footage that you received and what your reaction was to that footage?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me and my film to be here. It's such an honor to screen the film. And yeah, so the first batch, among the first batch of rushes I received in New York, I downloaded from the cloud service because my co-directors at that time, they will film at the end of every day, they will upload the footage onto a cloud service in China as a backup, and then I would download them in New York. Among the first batch of footage I received was actually the opening scene of the film, that the nurse was running down the hallway, right, trying to say goodbye to her father who had just passed away. I just remember, I think that was in mid-February last year, almost like exactly a year ago. And I just by that time I had read so much about what was happening in Wuhan, but to see the footage, to hear the agony in her wailing, and to feel like I was being transported to the eye of the storm, that I was feeling my whole body was shaking. I was in tears.
Yeah, it's an incredibly powerful scene. And I think one of the, in the film is beautifully edited and constructed. And I think one of the most wonderful things about it is that we are just sort of plunged straight into, as you call it, the eye of the storm. It's a very bracing opening. And so while we're slightly disorientated, you know, we don't have all of those regular cues, but I think it's very helpful for us as an audience to sort of, like the people in the film, we're just, the tsunami is on us. So your film premiered at the 2020 Toronto Film Festival. And it depicts these very early days of the pandemic. So I know that you've been asked this endlessly, but the sheer logistic of the film, watching it, you know, back in 2020 during Toronto, it was sort of inconceivable. I was watching the film and thinking, I don't understand how. So can you tell me, firstly, how did you come to make this film? Like, did this film find you, or did you seek the film out? And also your two collaborators who you worked with in China, what was the process of navigating that collaboration?
Yeah, so normally my documentary films have been really character driven rather than issue or news topic driven, because as a storyteller, I always wanted to bring something new to a topic I'm working on. And then if it's well covered by the news, sometimes I have doubts of what else I could bring to the table. But with COVID-19, I think it has become personal for a lot of people. You know, I was in China. I went back to Shanghai to spend Chinese New Year with my family when the lockdown happened. So even though Shanghai was pretty far away from Wuhan, I experienced firsthand how the entire country of China pretty much voluntarily shut down because people were so fearful of the virus. And then as soon as I came back to New York, a US network approached me and asked me whether I wanted to make a film. And I jumped on because I really wanted to figure out what was happening in Wuhan. And the way I went about doing production, I reached out to over a dozen filmmakers. I asked my filmmaker friends in China for introduction to if they knew anybody who had started filming in Wuhan. So I got in touch with over a dozen of them, and then they shared the footage. We had a lot of discussion. That's how I found my two co-directors, because by that time, among the group of filmmakers I talked to, some of them were filming inside a hospital, some were filming outside a hospital. But then I think as soon as I saw the footage from my two co-directors, I just immediately realized how rare it was. Even up to now, I don't think I've seen any footage like that from anywhere in the world. That's why I decided to collaborate with them. My two co-directors, you know, luckily they were both reporters, so they have a reporter's badge. And in China during the lockdown, access to the hospital were restricted to only medical professionals, patients, and reporters. my co-director Wei Shi Chen, he's a video reporter for Esquire China, but he wasn't sent by Esquire to cover the lockdown because that's not Esquire's regular beat. He, as an aspiring documentary filmmaker himself, he just really wanted to go to find out what's happening. So, but then even though he is a reporter, he has a reporter's badge, he was turned on by 4 different hospitals. And then through personal connection, he embedded himself with a medical team that was being sent from elsewhere in China to Wuhan to support the local hospitals. Because he arrived with a medical team, that's how he gained access. My other co-director, Anonymous, he's a photojournalist for local newspaper, state-owned newspaper. So he already knew a lot of the hospitals and medical staff. And he was there taking photos for the newspaper's news stories. That's how he gained access. But then he decided to start taking video because video, is a lot more powerful in terms of capture what's happening on the ground. It's kind of amazing, like even with China's kind of restriction on the hospital, my 2 co-directors were able to gain access because the decision was made at each individual hospital level. So it's up to each individual hospital's chief to decide whether to allow a reporter in or not. At the beginning of the lockdown, actually a lot of the hospital welcomed reporters to come in because the situation was so dire on the ground in Wuhan. They wanted people outside to know how many challenges they were facing.
Right.
Then, for example, like running out of PPE, so people would donate goods and ship them over to Wuhan. So they welcome reporters to come in. And once inside of the contamination zone, my 2 co-directors could pretty much roam freely because nobody had the time or energy to watch their shoulder to say you can only film this or that. So that's kind of like in huge contrast to my experience in New York. I was in New York in end of March. I really wanted to go inside the hospital to film. But in the US, I think in most developed democratic countries, we have the issues of patient privacy, first of all. Secondly, there's a huge liability concern, right? The hospitals don't want to, take on the liability if me or my crew got infected by with COVID. So I couldn't get in any hospital. And so I think that sometimes I feel like that's the irony, is like in a country where people usually think everything's being restricted, actually in times of chaos, there exists room for you to travel and film.
As you said, your previous films are very character-based, and your film All in the Family, which is a great film. It's available on Netflix, so I'd urge people to
Thank you.
to find find that. It's a really wonderful film. But given that the characters in this film evolve really slowly, and actually it's a film that I think that's a lot of the satisfaction of the film, is that you get things emerge as you watch. But most of the people in your film, we can't identify them because they're all in their PPE. So how did you, in the editing room, how did you find the characters that we see in the film that emerge throughout the production? So
in the beginning, when I first started putting this film together, I wasn't being very conscious about how to explain the what's written on the back of the PPE to a non-Chinese audience. I was just basically following my emotional instincts and trying to really find a story beat for each characters. I was mostly focusing on that. For example, like the old grandpa with dementia, right? He always just wanted to go home, but in the end, the hospital became his home. He didn't want to leave. And for the new couple, it's always about reuniting with their baby. And for head nurse Yang Li, is about returning personal effects of the death to the families. So I think because anytime, even though you cannot see their faces, you cannot read the Chinese on the back of their hazmat suit, because every time when the character appear, based on the story on the screen, you could pretty much associate that character, what's happening on the screen, what the action is, to that character. So I think that helped audience keep track of the characters. I think you pointed out, just like my previous film, originally I thought this film is going to be about how a city survives the lockdown. The bigger story about the viral outbreak in the city. But in the end, I think my instinct still guided me back to really focus on the characters, focus on the little details and the actions, and how they can still be kind to each other.
I imagine that it was a very specific choice to not make this a film about politics, or to not make it a sort of an investigative film, which I personally think makes the film a lot more powerful, because it doesn't really matter what part of the world you're in seeing this film. This is a universal, I mean, what happened in China has happened all over the world, and it's very universal. So did you always intend to not make it political, or was that something that came out through the editing, early in that editing process?
I think the film absolutely evolved as we went through production, post-production. In the very beginning, when I started out researching this film, my instinct was investigative. I really wanted to understand what happened, who was patient zero, why did the government suppress the information, the local government, at least the local government, suppressing information. What level which level of the government made the decision to not to disclose how horrible it was at the very beginning. But gradually, but quickly, a couple of things happened. First of all, is that I quickly realized it was really hard to get anybody on camera, especially in the early days of the lockdown, because there's very limited freedom of movement within Wuhan. And for people, even for those who were willing to speak to newspaper reporters, they didn't want to appear on camera. Very few of them were willing to. Secondly, I really couldn't find anything that's beyond what had already been reported in news media. For me, I kind of personally, I just don't want to replay, just transfer whatever's in printing press into visual media. And thirdly, I knew several other filmmaker friends of mine that were making films that's specifically addressing those beats. So I feel like I'm just looking at my footage, just what's most unique about my footage? How can I really treasure what's unique, not to distract, not to add too much into the film and distract from the main storyline or main message. And lastly, I think as I was making the film, as I started reading about past pandemics, about how each time when the pandemic happens, human society like to blame other peoples for their own mishandling of the responses. And also, I just feel like witnessing how the US government mishandled this really was a shocker to me. Really made me think about how any society, regardless authoritarian or democratic, why all types of society tend to fail in pandemic response. And
it's interesting,
yeah. And then I just feel like that's such a bigger question for us to ponder. That would take us time to look back and analyze and learn and draw conclusions. And right now, for me, I feel like it's too early for me personally to draw any conclusion. And that's part of the reason I decided to just to show what it's like for human beings to live through the pandemic, rather than trying to draw any political conclusions or put any news commentaries.
And it's quite a remarkable document for us to have this, for a moment in history that we're all living through in real time. So that's, I can't thank you enough for the film. I think it's beautifully made, and it's really important. And we're just thrilled to be able to screen it here in Melbourne. So just to finish, I wonder if there's any other documentaries, or has there been another film that has really sparked your senses in the last little while that you might want to recommend to our audience here tonight?
There'd be so many documentaries. Maybe I shouldn't pick any one above the other, because 2020 was a fantastically strong year for documentaries. Sure. But I think the narrative, I just recently watched The Father with Anthony Hopkins. It was just amazing, just like the way we get to experience what, sort of like dementia was like, through very subtle set changes, and also the acting was just superb. I enjoyed every single minute of that film. Highly recommend.
That's great. I'm sure that everyone can seek that out here. And it's been really lovely to have films to challenge us and comfort us through the last 12 months. And I just again like to say thank you so much for the film. It's really wonderful.
Thank you so much for your kind words about the film, and thank you for having me.